The wind howled through the dusty main street of Dry Creek, carrying with it the taste of desperation and sun-baked ruin. The town was dying, a skeleton of its former self. Its saloon half empty, its church leaning, and its people clinging to whatever scraps of decency they had left. On this sweltering afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside the old courthouse for something they called the Dollar Bride Auction. It wasn't official business, but everyone knew what it meant. Women stranded in the West, widowed or abandoned, were offered to men who could take them in, for a price as low as $1. Among the women standing at the edge of the platform was Evelyn Carter. Her once fine traveling dress hung in tatters, and her boots were worn thin. Her husband had died along the trail weeks earlier, fever, starvation, she couldn't tell anymore. The wagon train left her behind when she couldn't pay her passage. She had begged for work in town, but all she'd earned were cruel looks and half-spoken offers that made her skin crawl. Now she stood in front of the crowd like a piece of discarded furniture, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air. $1! $1 to take her home, feed her, give her a place to sleep. The words made her stomach twist. She wasn't a wife anymore, not even a woman, really. Just a body someone might buy. The townsfolk laughed nervously, muttering among themselves. No one wanted the trouble of taking in another mouth to feed. A few men stared with the kind of hunger that made her tremble. Evelyn swallowed hard, her lips cracked from the heat, and whispered to herself, "Please, just make it quick." At the edge of the crowd stood a tall, broad-shouldered man with gray eyes and a weathered hat pulled low. Caleb Rowe, the lonely rancher of Hollow Ridge. Folks said he hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since his wife and boy died in a thunderstorm 5 years ago. His ranch had gone silent, fences unpatched, fields overgrown, the house gathering dust. He lived with ghosts, and everyone in Dry Creek knew better than to bother him. But today, something stirred in him as he watched Evelyn standing there, frail, beaten, yet refusing to fall apart. When the auctioneer repeated the call, $1! A hush fell over the crowd as Caleb stepped forward. Without a word, he pulled a silver coin from his coat and set it down on the wooden crate. $1, he said. His voice was deep, calm, final. Evelyn lifted her head, startled. The townspeople whispered. Some smirked, others pitied her. The auctioneer nodded and handed her a small slip of paper, a meaningless formality. Caleb didn't reach for her or lay a hand on her arm. He simply said, "Get your things. We leave before sundown." As they walked toward his horse, Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She tried to speak, but the words came out trembling. "Please, just make it quick." Caleb turned slowly, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Not like a man studying what he'd bought, but as if trying to understand what she meant. Finally, he said, "You'll work. You'll eat. That's all I expect." Then he mounted his horse, helped her up behind him, and rode away from the murmuring crowd and their cruel laughter. The setting sun bled red across the desert sky as Dry Creek disappeared behind them. Evelyn held on, silent, wondering if she'd just traded one kind of misery for another. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and exhaustion, a flicker of something fragile stirred, the faint, dangerous hope that maybe this man, the one who paid a single dollar for her, wouldn't treat her like everyone else had. And as the night swallowed the plains, that hope, though small, refused to die. The ride to Caleb Rowe's ranch was long and wordless. The plain stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by distant mesas and the occasional tumbleweed. The sun sank low, casting copper light over the land. Evelyn sat stiffly behind Caleb, her hands gripping the worn leather of the saddle. Every hoofbeat felt like a countdown. To what, she didn't know. All she could think of was what men usually wanted from women like her, and how quickly they took it. By the time they reached the ranch, night had fallen. The house appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, a weather-beaten two-story building with a sagging porch and empty windows staring into the cold wind. The barn stood nearby, its roof patched and leaning, and the corral gates creaked in protest as Caleb dismounted. "You can sleep inside," he said flatly, handing her a small oil lamp. There's stew on the stove. I'll tend the horses. Evelyn hesitated in the doorway, unsure if it was a trick. Inside, the air smelled of dust and loneliness. Furniture covered in sheets, a Bible left open on a table, a child's wooden horse lying on the floor. Everything felt frozen in time. The fire had long gone cold, yet the faint scent of lilac soap lingered, as if a woman had only just left the room. She found a pot of stew, cold but edible, and forced herself to eat. When Caleb came in, he said nothing. He hung his coat, washed his hands in silence, and nodded toward the guest room. "You can use that bed. Tomorrow I'll show you the work that needs doing." Evelyn's heart raced. She clutched her shawl tighter, waiting for the moment he would close the distance, the way other men had. But Caleb didn't. He only looked tired, not from the day's ride, but from years of carrying something too heavy to name. That night, she lay awake in the small room, staring at the ceiling. The wind rattled the shutters and thunder grumbled in the distance. Then she heard it, a low voice from across the hall. Caleb was talking to someone, his tone soft, almost pleading. "I tried, Sarah. I tried to keep them safe." Evelyn froze. There was no reply, of course. The man was speaking to ghosts. The realization sent a strange chill through her, pity mixed with fear. Whatever haunted him wasn't just memory. It was still alive in his heart. The thunder grew louder, shaking the windows. Evelyn's body tensed as rain began to pour, and with every flash of lightning, old horrors flashed in her mind. Nights spent on the trail, hands grabbing, voices laughing. She stumbled out of bed, clutching her blanket, and fled to the barn, hiding among the hay bales like a frightened child. That's where Caleb found her. His lantern cut a circle of gold through the darkness, and his face softened when he saw her curled in the corner, trembling. "You don't have to hide," he said gently. "Please," she whispered, the same words she'd said in town. "Just make it quick." Caleb froze, understanding dawning in his eyes. Slowly he set down the lantern and crouched beside her. "No one's going to hurt you here," he said. "Not while you're under my roof." His voice was rough, but there was truth in it, deep and steady. Evelyn's breath came uneven, but she believed him, even if she didn't know why. He offered his coat, draping it over her shoulders before walking away without another word. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the rain and the steady sound of his boots fading into the night. When dawn came, the storm had passed. Evelyn stepped outside, watching the sunrise spill across the plains. The air was clean and cool, the world reborn in light. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone's possession, just a person breathing in the quiet. Inside, Caleb sat by the window, staring out with that same haunted stillness. He didn't speak as she entered, but when she began sweeping the floor, he simply nodded. It wasn't thanks, but it was something. A fragile truce between two broken souls trying to remember how to live again. Weeks passed on the Rowe Ranch, and the days began to fall into a rhythm, hard, quiet, and strangely comforting. Evelyn rose before dawn to milk the cows, gather eggs, and tend the vegetable patch that had gone wild with weeds. Caleb spent his hours repairing fences and working the fields, saying little but always leaving tools or food where she could find them. The silence that once felt heavy was now something else. Not empty, but peaceful. Like two people learning to breathe in the same air without fear. The house slowly began to change, too. The curtains that had been shut for years were opened to let the light in. The dust-covered furniture was cleaned and polished until the room seemed to remember warmth. Evelyn planted herbs outside the kitchen window, coaxing life from the parched earth, while Caleb watched from a distance, quietly surprised at how easily she fit into the spaces that had long been hollow. Still, ghosts lingered. Sometimes, she'd catch him staring at the photograph on the mantel, a woman and a little boy, both smiling beneath the wide sky. He never spoke of them, but one evening as the sun dipped low, she found the courage to ask. "Your wife?" she said softly. Caleb nodded once. "Sarah, and our son Ben." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. "Storm came through one spring. Took the barn, the cattle, and them. He looked away, his jaw tight. Haven't been able to fix much since. Evelyn didn't try to comfort him. Instead, she just said, "You kept the place standing. That counts for something." He gave a small, sad smile, the first she'd seen. "Maybe," he murmured, "but it don't feel like living." That night, while Caleb mended tack by lamplight, Evelyn found herself humming softly as she sewed an old shirt. The tune, something her mother used to sing back east, filled the house with a fragile warmth. Caleb looked up from his work, his expression unreadable, and for a moment the silence between them wasn't lonely. The next morning she joined him in the fields. He handed her a spade and said, "You plant, I'll plow." She smiled faintly. "That's fair." Together they worked side by side under the wide sky, their shadows moving across the dirt like old memories, finally learning to let go. As the weeks turned to months, Evelyn began to laugh again, small, careful laughs that startled even her. She learned to ride the old mare in the corral, though she fell more than once. Caleb, standing at the fence, tried not to show how proud he was. One afternoon he taught her to shoot. The revolver felt heavy in her trembling hands, but he stood behind her, steadying her aim. "Don't think about what you're afraid of," he said quietly. "Just breathe." She fired, the sound echoing through the canyon. When the tin can flew off the fence post, she turned to him, eyes wide. "I did it." "You did," he said simply, but there was a warmth in his voice she hadn't heard before. They began sharing supper at the same table, speaking more freely. Caleb told her about his first years in the territory, and Evelyn shared fragments of her life before everything fell apart. A small cottage near the Mississippi, a family that had vanished into the war. They were two people from broken worlds, learning to build something new from the ruins. But the peace couldn't last. The town of Dry Creek, always hungry for gossip, began whispering again. They called her the Dollar Bride, the woman a rancher bought for pity or for pleasure. The words reached Evelyn's ears one morning when she rode into town for supplies. The women turned their backs. A group of men laughed behind her, one shouting, "How much for another $1, miss?" Her hands shook as she paid the storekeeper and rode home, the laughter still echoing in her head. When Caleb saw her face and asked what was wrong, she only said, "It's nothing." But inside, the old fear returned, that she'd never be more than what the world decided she was. As night fell, she stood on the porch staring at the land she had come to love. The wind was warm, the stars endless, but peace felt fragile again, like the soil beneath her feet could crack at any moment. She didn't know it yet, but the past, hers and Caleb's, was riding toward them, dust and danger gathering on the horizon. The first sign of trouble came with the dust cloud rising on the horizon, a lone rider cutting across the plains toward the ranch. Caleb noticed it before Evelyn did. He was mending a gate near the corral when the figure appeared, moving slow but sure, the sun glinting off his revolver. Evelyn was kneeling in the garden, her hands buried in soil, when she looked up and froze. She recognized that slouched hat, that swagger, the kind of man who carried lies in his smile. James Walker. Once, long ago, he had been her salvation, or so she thought. He'd promised her safety when her husband died, promised her food and passage west. But Walker was a drifter, a gambler, and when her money ran out, so did his kindness. He had sold her once before, to a man in Kansas City who called it temporary work. Evelyn had escaped, barely, and thought she'd left that nightmare behind. But the past had found her. "Afternoon, darling," Walker drawled as he reined in his horse by the porch. "Didn't think I'd find you playing house with a rancher." His grin was all teeth. Caleb stepped between them before Evelyn could speak. "You've got the wrong place, mister," Walker chuckled, dismounting. "Oh, I don't think so. Name's James Walker. That woman there, she's mine." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Walker turned to Caleb, spreading his hands. "See, that's the thing about women like her, friend. They forget their debts. I took her in, fed her, kept her alive. Now she owes me. I'll be taking her back." Caleb's expression didn't change, but his voice grew colder. You'd best leave. The tension hung heavy, the air thick with unspoken violence. Walker leaned closer, eyes glinting with cruelty. You think she told you the truth, cowboy? Ask her about the money she stole from me before she ran off, or the men she lied to along the trail. Evelyn's face went pale. Shame burned in her chest. It was true. She had stolen a few dollars from him to buy food when he left her starving in a wagon yard. But hearing it now, twisted into something foul, made her heart pound with guilt. Walker smirked at her silence. See? You don't really know her. She's good at playing helpless. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes, not because of Walker's words, but because Caleb didn't defend her. He simply turned away, walking back toward the corral. That night, Evelyn packed her few belongings. Caleb didn't stop her. When she tried to explain, her voice shaking, her hands trembling, he only said, "You don't owe me anything." She wanted him to ask her to stay, to believe her, to fight for her. But he didn't. His silence hurt worse than Walker's cruelty. Before dawn, she saddled the mare and rode off toward the river. The world was gray with early mist, the land stretching endlessly before her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't bear to stay where her past had poisoned everything. Back at the ranch, Caleb watched from the porch as the faint outline of her figure disappeared into the distance. He felt something in his chest break, something he'd thought had already died with his family. By afternoon, he rode into town for supplies and heard the news. Walker had followed her. The bartender said he'd seen the man heading west with a whiskey bottle in one hand and a cruel grin on his face. Caleb's stomach turned cold. He knew what kind of man Walker was, the kind who took what he wanted and destroyed what he couldn't have. That night, a storm began to roll across the plains. Caleb saddled his horse, checked his rifle, and rode out into the darkness. The lightning split the sky and the rain came down hard. He didn't know if Evelyn still wanted saving, but he knew he couldn't let another storm take someone he cared about. Somewhere out there, beneath the roaring thunder, a reckoning was coming. The storm swept across the plains like a living thing, rain slashing sideways, lightning carving the horizon. Caleb rode hard through the darkness, his oilskin coat soaked through, his hat pulled low. Each flash of light revealed a glimpse of the trail, the muddy prints of two horses, Evelyn's mare and Walker's roan. He followed them west through gullies and ravines, his heart pounding with something more than fear, guilt. He'd let her ride away, believing she was safer without him. But now, as thunder boomed overhead, all he could hear was her voice that first night. Please, just make it quick. He hadn't realized then that she wasn't just afraid of men, but of being forgotten, discarded, used, and he'd done exactly that. Miles away, Evelyn was fighting the storm too. Walker had found her near the river crossing, soaked and exhausted. She'd tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed her reins, dragging her down from the saddle. Now! Now! He sneered, gripping her arm. After all I've done for you, this is how you repay me? Let me go, she shouted, struggling, but his hand struck her across the face. The rain swallowed her cry. Walker shoved her toward an abandoned barn near the trees, a rotting structure left over from some long-forgotten homestead. He forced her inside, tying her wrists to a post. You ran from me once, he growled. You won't again. When the storm's over, I'll take you back east. They'll pay well for a woman like you. Evelyn's tears mixed with the rainwater streaming down her face. Her voice broke. You don't own me, James, he laughed, cruel and bitter. Everyone belongs to someone out here, even the ones who think they're free. Outside, a flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, and then came the sound of hooves. Walker turned, squinting through the open barn door. Caleb Rowe emerged from the darkness, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes burning like steel. Let her go, Caleb said, his voice low and even. Walker grinned, half drunk, half mad. Well, look who came riding through the rain for his dollar bride. She ain't yours, Caleb replied. Oh, she ain't yours either. Walker barked a laugh. You paid $1 for her. A fine bargain, I'd say. You both got what you wanted, something inside Caleb snapped. You don't know a damn thing about her. Or me. Walker raised his gun. The two men stared each other down as thunder rolled above them. Then, in the chaos of the storm, Walker fired first. The shot missed by inches, shattering a wooden beam. Caleb dove aside, returning fire. The bullet grazed Walker's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. The gunpowder ignited a stack of dry hay. Flames flared instantly, feeding on the wind. Within moments, the barn was an inferno. Evelyn screamed as smoke filled the air. Caleb dropped his rifle and ran to her, slicing through the ropes with his knife. Come on, he shouted, coughing through the smoke. The roof began to groan above them. Walker, clutching his bleeding arm, staggered toward the door, but rage overtook him. He lunged at Caleb with a broken board, screaming, You'll die with her! Evelyn grabbed Walker's fallen revolver. Her hands trembled, but her aim was steady. No, she said, and fired. The shot echoed through the storm. Walker fell, his body crumpling into the firelight. Caleb pulled Evelyn into his arms, dragging her out just as the roof collapsed behind them. Outside, rain poured over the burning wreckage. Evelyn knelt beside Caleb, who was bleeding from a burn along his side. She pressed her hands against it, shaking. You saved me, she whispered. He looked at her, rain and ash streaking his face. No, he said weakly. You saved us. They sat there until dawn, the storm fading, the barn still smoking. Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver coin, the $1 he'd paid for her weeks ago. She pressed it into his hand. You gave me back my life, she said softly. So here, take it back. Caleb looked down at the coin, its edge blackened from the fire, and closed his fist around it. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes told her what he couldn't speak. The storm was over, but something new had begun, fragile, scarred, and real. The fire had burned itself out by morning. The storm clouds drifted away, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and smoke. The barn was nothing but a skeleton of charred beams, and the once blackened sky had turned soft and gold with the first light of dawn. Evelyn sat beside Caleb on the muddy ground, her shawl wrapped around his shoulders. He was pale, exhausted, and burned along his left side, but alive. That alone felt like a miracle. They didn't speak for a long while. Only the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint hiss of the dying fire. Evelyn's hands were blistered and bruised, her dress torn and soaked, yet she felt strangely calm. The terror, the shame, the fear that had followed her from one place to another, it was gone, burned away with the barn. When Caleb finally opened his eyes, he saw her sitting beside him. Her hair tangled, her face streaked with soot. You should have left me, he murmured, voice rough. Would have been safer. Evelyn shook her head, her expression fierce despite her exhaustion. You think after everything I'd let you die for me? A faint smile ghosted across his lips. Guess not. She helped him onto his horse, and together they made their slow way back to the ranch. The ride was long and painful. Caleb could barely sit straight, and Evelyn had to guide the reins, holding him steady every few miles. The land around them shimmered with the freshness of rain. Green shoots pushing through the soil, puddles glinting like mirrors under the sun. When they reached the ranch, Evelyn half carried him inside, cleaned his wounds, and dressed the burns with cloth soaked in cool water and herbs. Caleb gritted his teeth, muttering curses under his breath, but never once pushed her away. For days, she nursed him back to health. She cooked when he could eat, read to him when the pain grew too heavy, and tended the ranch alone while he rested. Sometimes she caught him watching her quietly, not with the hollow look he'd worn for years, but with something warmer. One afternoon, as she was sweeping the porch, she heard him call her name. She turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway, still weak but upright, his arm in a sling. You should rest, she said. He shook his head. I've done enough of that. He stepped forward, holding out something in his hand. When she saw what it was, her breath caught. The $1 coin, tarnished and scarred from the fire. I thought I lost that, she murmured. Caleb nodded. You gave it back to me that night, but I don't want it. He pressed it gently into her palm. You keep it. Let it mean something else now. Evelyn looked down at the coin, the same one that once marked her as property, and for the first time, it didn't feel like shame. It felt like proof that she had survived, that she had turned something cruel into something sacred. Days passed, and the ranch began to heal as they did. Evelyn repaired the fence, replanted the garden, and painted the old shutters. Caleb began to work again, slower but with purpose. Together, they rebuilt not just the ranch, but themselves. One morning, she found the coin on her nightstand with a small note in Caleb's handwriting, debt repaid. Now, if you stay, it's because you choose to. Tears welled in her eyes. She walked outside to find him by the corral, tightening a rope. The sun was rising, painting the land in hues of fire and gold. She walked toward him, the note still in her hand. I'm not going anywhere, she said simply. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since his wife and child had died, his eyes were free of ghosts. You sure? He asked quietly. Evelyn nodded. I'm sure. He smiled then, small but real, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had finally come back to life. He reached for her hand, rough against her own, and together they stood watching the sunrise spill across the land that had once been their prison, now their redemption. The wind moved gently through the fields, carrying away the ashes of the past. The ranch once haunted breathed again, and so did they.